Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell expected to unveil a number of bills here that Republicans have agreed to in alignment. Still questions remain over what will happen when they debate those with Democrats here to get things moving. But one of the key updates on that front would be cuts to that $600 unemployment benefit at the federal level, which we've already seen expire here, as a lot of Americans who are out of work have been counting on that. Looks to be shrinking from $600 a week to about $200 under the GOP proposal. And here to kick things off with us is Mattie Duppler, National Taxpayers Union Senior Fellow. And Mattie, this is basically the one that a lot of people have been watching for just because of the sheer impact of what might happen when you take $600 in benefits a week and shrink it down to just $200. We got the update from EPI in a new report saying that that could shed about 3.4 million jobs from the American economy. It could also shave about 2.5% off GDP growth through next year. We'll be chatting that in the next hour of the ticker. But first, want to get your thoughts on what you think about whether or not that's even something Democrats might agree to here.
Well, Zach, as always, the two sides are far apart when it comes to politics, but on substance, this has really been the issue that's been the sticking point. Now, the GOP proposal would shrink that benefit to $200 rather than $600, just for the time period it would take for state systems to figure out a way to prorate benefits for workers to more closely align with the wages they were earning prior to going into unemployment. Now, there's a couple problems with that. One, shrinking from 600 to 200 is a pretty big jump for a worker who's been out of work now for maybe 4 or 5 months. But secondly, the reason that the CARES Act included a $600 a week, benefit for workers above what they were getting at the state level is because state systems do not have the ability to make that calculation. Each state system is different. It's a morass of very difficult calculations and how they arrive at benefit calculations. And they're also running on very antiquated technology. So over the last couple of months, as these systems have had tens of millions of new enrollees come on them, it's not clear at all that they've been able to make any kind of advancements that would allow them to make that new calculation. So I do think when it comes to what Republicans are putting down here, it's a marker. It's not going to be the end product because Congress can do a lot right now to give certainty to workers and businesses. What they can't do is harangue state systems into completely overhauling their UI programs so that they could deliver some kind of prorated benefit rather than that flat amount that was in the CARES Act.
Yeah, it's going to be trying to figure out what that eventually comes to. It sounds like Republicans are looking to get back to 70% of wages, as you noted, in terms of what happens after that interim and really giving states the amount of time here. But it does kind of signal a large gap. Of course, Democrats wanted that $600 payment to continue through the end of the year that was passed in the CARES Act. And in the HEROES Act, I mean, that's a $3 trillion bill versus, the $1 million or $1 trillion mark that Republicans are kind of trying to stay to. It's unclear where they'll meet in the middle. But I mean, when we think about the size of this bill and what needs to come through, is we're seeing case counts turn the opposite direction. Still a lot of concerns that this pandemic will get worse in the coming months. What's your take on where the middle ground might be in terms of the overall size package here, as at least they did agree to, it sounds like, another round of that $1,200 stimulus check max?
That's right. Well, Zach, I would say the middle ground rests in what Congress has already done with the CARES Act. There's a number of principles that both parties agreed to in the CARES Act that could pave the way for another round, not just of stimulus checks, as you mentioned, but also expanded support for employers and for workers. There's things like the Employee Retention Tax Credit and the PPP program. Having better harmony between those two programs to allow employers to keep their employees on payroll, because of course now it's end of July. We all thought we'd be in a better situation now than we are. That means that we need the support that was included in the CARES Act to extend further as well. And that's why that discussion about UI is so important as well. There has not been bipartisan consensus that extending them till the end of the year is actually the most helpful thing we can do. There has been a lot of concern from economists across the aisle about how long you extend benefits like that, because at some point it does start to create a friction for workers to get them back on the front lines. Now, we've seen right now, most of that is dictated by what's happening with the infection rate. The problem we have with getting employees back on the front lines and working in their jobs right now is demand, not so much that they're getting unemployment benefits above what they would have been paid. So I would say the UI is going to be the main sticking point. Getting those stimulus checks out the door will probably be the easiest sticking point. And then getting those tax changes and those harmonization between the PPP and the ERTC program that were in the CARES program, that might be that middle ground where we could see a lot of progress.
And I would really like, for everyone out there who's watching this show, waiting for this next round of stimulus to come through here, I'd really like to say that those were really the only sticking points to discuss. But there is another rather large one in what will happen with state funding. That's been kind of another point here that we've seen Republicans and Democrats not initially agreeing to, and it's going to be a big piece of this, I think, when we get the full plan here later on today. But one of those question marks that's really the reason why this one's so large is because we're talking about billions of dollars from states here in funding gaps. Even in New York, you look at that, the MTA exhausting the funds that they got through the CARES Act, saying that they're still looking at a pretty large shortfall here. So, I mean, when we think about what Republicans and Democrats might want to do on the state funding front, we've had a number of guests on the show say that it's going to be disastrous in terms of kind of creating some of the same problems we saw in the Great Recession, where state funding was getting cut at the same time the federal government was trying to spur a recovery here. So what's your take on that, and how that might be another point that needs to be agreed to before we get some sort of bill come through here?
Yeah, I think there is an appetite to do something on state funding. The question, of course, is what? Now, the HEROES Act, which is the House Democrat bill that was passed several months ago, lays out hundreds of billions of dollars in new funding for states. It's not clear that the situation will be that dire for states. One, because of their unemployment systems being able to absorb at first this huge onslaught of workers, but then seeing those workers eventually come off of those payrolls. That's going to create a lot more breathing room compared to something like the Great Recession, where we had extended unemployment and workers not getting back to work for years and years. The hope here is that we have a very acute contraction in the economic landscape that gets better with each month as we work through 2020 and into 2021. Now, it won't be back to where we were prior to February, but we will certainly see a glide path that will hopefully improve the employment landscape enough where you'll see those revenues improve at the state level, and you also won't see as much pressure on their state programs. Certainly, there is a role for the federal government to play here, but I think Congress needs to be cautious about just the extent of how much money they can give states before really knowing the full scope of the budget problem that those states are going to face.